In this video, you're going to learn how to use the callback chaining pattern with your asynchronous Node.js code. So right now in app.js, we do indeed have two asynchronous I/O operations. The problem is that both are operating completely independently of the other. We fire both off and they each get the response and just dump it to the console. That's actually not what we want. With the callback chaining pattern, we're going to be able to do one thing, then the next, which means we'll be able to geocode an address, then we can take the coordinates and use that as the input for some other asynchronous I/O operation. In this case, we will pass the coordinates to forecast. To get started, we need to take our call to forecast and move it to where we have the geocoding output. Where do we have that geocoding output? In our callback function for geocode. So what I'm going to do is take this forecast call and cut it out, copying it to the clipboard. Then up above, I'm going to paste it right inside of the geocode callback function. Now, what do we have? Well, we start with a call to geocode. We start this asynchronous operation, and when it's done, we know that the event loop is going to make sure our callback gets called. From there, we're going to kick off another asynchronous I/O operation. Then we're going to wait for that callback to finish, and inside of here, we'll have access to the final data. So this is callback chaining. We are chaining together multiple callbacks to do multiple things in a specific order. Now, what do we have to do? Well, we have to make sure that the data properties, latitude and longitude, get used as the input for the forecast function. Right here, I'm going to take our first argument where I have my static number, and I'm going to remove that, and instead, I'm going to get the property off of data up above. So this is the success output from geocode. Now we know that data has latitude, longitude, and we also added that other property, location, all of which we could choose to use. In this case, we need the latitude property, so data.latitude as the first argument to forecast. Now, as the second argument to forecast, we want to use the longitude. So over here, we're going to go ahead and get that done. I'm going to remove the static number we have in place for that second argument, and I'll replace it with data.longitude. Perfect. Now that we have this in place, the input for forecast comes from the output for geocode, and the end result is that we're going to get the weather for Boston because that's what's passed into geocode up above. Let's go ahead and make sure this actually works as expected. Right here, I'm going to save app.js, and down below, we're going to run the file. So node app.js, and what do we get? We're going to get two pieces of output. And you'll notice that the geocoding information printed first. We got our data because things went well. Then down below, we got our forecast because, once again, things went well. Now you'll notice something pretty suspicious. It currently says it is negative 18 degrees, and that's in Fahrenheit in Boston. It's not. It is mid-November, clearly not that cold. The problem here is that I've actually reversed the order of latitude and longitude. So the latitude comes second with the index of 1, and the longitude comes first with the index of 0. So that's going to actually bring our application to a working state. Sorry for the confusion there, and now we get a temperature that makes a bit more sense. I reran the program. We still get our data printing, but we can see the properties are reversed to the correct ones, and down below we get the forecast for Boston. Once again, clear throughout the day, but now it's about 40 degrees, so above freezing, as opposed to minus 18. Now that we have the basics in place, let's make sure we're still handling things like our errors. So right here, if something goes wrong with geocode, we want to make sure to use the error message in some sort of way, and we want to make sure we don't run the forecast call down below. If something went wrong with geocode, we won't have the input necessary to actually run forecast. So right here, we're going to use a condition. If there is an error, do something. What are we going to do? For now, we'll continue to print it. Now, the goal here is to print the error, but the goal is to also not run the other code down here. Now, there are two ways we could get that done. One is to toss on an else clause. We put all of this code inside of else, and we know that only one of the two will run. Another approach worth noting is that you could just use return inside of here. Return is going to stop the function execution after printing the error message to the console, and this is a very common pattern, so I'm going to use it here to give you a bit more exposure to it. Now, if there is an error, the function stops and the error prints. Otherwise, down below, we continue on. Now, we don't need these console.log calls. The next thing we want to do, if we do have data, is to call forecast, and that's exactly what we're currently doing. Now, we know that things can go wrong with forecast as well, so let's go ahead and set up our if statement inside of there. If something goes wrong with forecast, once again, I'll use return to stop this callback function, and I will just print the error message to the console. So down below, this is where we put the code that runs if both requests worked. If we geocoded and we got the forecast, we can put our final code right here. And what are we going to do here? Well, the goal here is to print two things. I want to print the location property from geocode so people know what they're seeing the weather for. And I also want to obviously print the forecast, which is the data that comes back from the forecast function. Both of those are going to print down below, giving the user all of the information we were hoping to provide. Now, the goal is to use the output from both geocode and forecast. The problem, though, is that the argument name is the same for each. So down below in our forecast callback function, we're only ever going to be able to access the data here. The data here is going to shadow over data up above. All we have to do to address that is to come up with a unique name for one or both. So right here, I could call this something like forecast data. Now I have data and forecast data. There's unique names, and I can access both down below. I'm going to remove those example console.log calls we had before, and we're going to start by printing the location. That is data.location, the last property from the geocode output that we have not used yet. Then down below the location, we're going to print the forecast. So console.log forecast data. Now that we have this in place, we have a pretty good setup. In the terminal, we can run our application, node space app.js. And if I fire that command off, what do I get? I get my location information followed by my forecast. Now here I can see which Boston I'm looking for. So if I was looking for a Boston in a different state or a different country, I would know that I'm not actually getting the weather for what I intended to get the weather for, and I could refine my search result even more to get a different Boston. So after the location, we have the forecast. Once again, still clear throughout the day, with a temperature of 39.55 degrees and a 0% chance of rain. So this is the final output we're going to have if things go as they were supposed to. The only thing left to do is to make sure that the user can actually provide the location without needing to modify the source code. So we want to get this value, which is currently hard-coded, in as a command line argument. Getting that done is going to be your challenge for the video, and down below I have some challenge comments outlining what I'd like you to do. The big picture goal: accept a location via a command line argument. Now you're going to access this single value without using any module like yargs. You can use the standard functionality we explored on process, and that was the second video of section 3. So if you forget exactly how that worked, that's okay. Go back to the video to jog your memory or use the PDF guide, then you can actually integrate it into the app here. Now, once you have the argument, you're going to use that string as the input for geocode. So instead of having the static string Boston, you'll reference the value the user provided. Now, you're obviously only going to do that if a location was provided. If you're not seeing any argument provided, you can go ahead and print a message saying something like, please provide an address, and then you would not run geocode. And you could just use an else and an if statement to get that done. Now, the last thing is to test your work with a couple of locations, and this I will give you. So down below, it's going to look a bit like this, node app.js. There's not going to be anything fancy. We're just going to provide the location right here. So if I wanted to search for Boston, it would look like this. Now, if I wanted to search for a search query that had 2 words, I would have to put those in double quotes like new space York. So you want to make sure that both of these work. And in the end of the day, you're going to get this and this as the first argument value. So take some time to refer back to what we covered quite some time ago and use it in the application here. When you're done, test with those 2 locations and make sure you get what at least look like accurate temperatures. All right, take some time to knock that out, and when you're done, come back and click play. How'd you do? To get this done, you needed to use the argv property on process, which we explored earlier. So if I just dump that to the console, we can see what we get when we run commands like these. Process.argv. I'm going to save the program. Down below, I'm going to rerun one of those commands, and we can see what's on that argv variable. Right here, as we talked about earlier, the third value is the first thing we provided. The first thing is the path to the node executable. The second thing is the path to the script we ran. And the third is, in this case, New York, or in the case of the other command, Boston. That is what we want. So right here, you could have created a variable like address, setting it equal to process.argv, accessing the third item with the index of 2. So now we have access to the command line argument, and we want to use it as the input for geocode down below. So instead of the static string Boston, I'm going to grab whatever value is stored on the address variable. Now this doesn't account for if no location was provided, but for the moment we can at least test things out. Down below, I'm going to rerun the exact same command using New York as my search term. If I run it, what do I get? I get New York in the United States, and I get the temperature for that. Now I could run a different location, node app.js Philadelphia. I don't have to put it in quotes because it's just a single word. And if I fire that off, I get the weather for where I currently am filming this video. So now that we have that in place, we want to make sure we only geocode if an address is provided. Otherwise, we'll print some sort of little string. That's going to be what needs to happen for step 3, and we could get that done with an if statement. So right here, if there is no address, what are we going to do? Console.log. Please provide an address. Otherwise, inside of an else clause, we're going to go ahead and run the code we had down below. So I'll take my geocode call from beginning all the way to end. I'm going to cut it out of its current location, and I'm going to paste it right inside of else. So that takes care of steps 1, 2, and 3. Now we're just going to test our work and make sure we do get the error message when no address is provided. I'm going to remove the challenge comments as well as a couple of those extra lines, and I'm going to test things out. So down below, let's run node space app.js. When I do that, I would expect to see please provide an address, and that is exactly what I get. Now node app.js Dublin. I'm going to fire that off, and this time we do indeed get a valid location, Dublin, Ireland, and I do indeed get the temperature for that. Now, if I was looking for a different Dublin, I could be more specific inside of quotes, like Dublin, PA, that's where I grew up, and if I fire that off, now I'm getting Dublin in Pennsylvania in the United States. With that in place, the challenge is all done. Now, there are plenty of ways you could have solved this. You might not have used the exact same setup, and that is A-okay, as long as you're getting similar results for those commands. That's where we're going to stop for this one. I'm excited to continue on in the next video, so let's go ahead and jump right in.